So Saul learned that all the great kings and leaders, the warriors and the prophets, Moses and Joshua, Samuel and Saul, David and Solomon, had been great and powerful only when they obeyed the commandments of God. And when the story of the downfall of his own namesake, King Saul, was told to him, they would say simply, "He disobeyed God and God rejected him." So the boy thought of God as one and eternal and all-powerful, very just and stern with those who disobeyed him, yet merciful to those who were sorry for their disobedience. And he waited for the new king who was to come to free his people, and he grew to be very keen about all the 1001 special religious observances that made the Jews feel themselves to be the people of God. This was the first and longest and richest thread that flashed to and fro in the loom of Saul's life, and was woven into the woof of his very being. But it was only the first. 2. The thread of beauty. As Saul went down to the water's edge with his companions he would see young men in white tunics and sandals mooring their boats and then running up wide marble steps. At the top they joined other youths who were chatting among the great gleaming pillars, some of them rubbing oil into their glistening bare bodies. From within came the sound of cheering, the panting of wrestlers straining to throw one another, the ring of the thrown javelin on the pavement. Then a team of students would run down the steps, and diving into the water, race one another in a swim upstream and back again. In a quieter place among the further pillars in the shade a group had settled round an older man. Some stood, leaning against the white pillars, others sat on the pavement. Nearly all had tablets of wax in the left hand and an ivory style in the right, ready to put down some witty saying or wise idea of the Greek tutor. Then they would argue, and questions and answers would fly to and fro more swiftly than arrows in a battle. If Saul were near enough to hear what the tutor was saying he would be almost sure to hear the words, "Athenodorus said," followed by some great maxim which the students would quickly scribble down on their tablets. Athenodorus had died at Tarsus just about the time when Saul was born, and he was the most wonderful teacher in the world in his day. Indeed, some of the things Saul wrote when he was a man are so similar to the sayings of Athenodorus that the boy Saul may have learned them first from some pupil of Athenodorus himself in Tarsus. Partly because of Athenodorus, the fame of this Tarsus university was spreading through all the Mediterranean. And Saul would be able to talk to the students of the university because, although he spoke the Aramaic language of the Hebrews to his father and mother at home, and his strict father would not like him to mix too much with people who were not Jews, yet he talked Greek, and indeed even read the Law and the Prophets in a Greek translation. Greek was the language in which men of different races talked to one another in Tarsus. This seems strange to us, because Tarsus is 1,000 miles from Greece. But as many as 2,000 years before Saul was born, Greek sailors, coming along the coast all the way from the Aegean Sea, had sailed up the Cydnus River and settled at Tarsus, and had traded in the silver and lead which men mined in the mountains. Assyrian armies and Persian had swept across the plain from the east and had conquered Tarsus, but still the Greeks remained there. When Saul went with his father to buy a new pair of sandals the money which he gave to the cobbler had Greek letters all round it. Saul would be told as a boy by the Tarsians, who were very proud of the history of their city, that over 300 years before young Alexander the Great, the Greek emperor, had covered the plain and filled the city with his great armies. He had nearly killed himself in this very river by leaping in all hot, when the water was bitterly cold with the melted snow from the white Taurus mountains. The Greeks carved beautiful statues which Saul's father would hate because a good Jew would think of them as idols. They also went into training for sports while, at the same time, training their brains to be swift and agile. The Jews trained their boys to glory in the past rather than think out new ideas, and to think more of the life of the spirit than of the body and mind. The Greeks taught their boys to think new thoughts, and they liked quickness of mind and witty speaking better than a wonderful memory or deep, wise old proverbs. The wonder of Saul was that he remembered the old like a Jew, but created new and adventurous thoughts more swiftly than even the Greek. Sitting there at the water's edge, Saul would spy, among the boats sailing up and down the broad river, some with strange figures painted on them, sometimes a ram, or a pair of scales, or the sun god Apollo. These he knew were Greek boats painted with signs to bring the sailors good luck. His brooding eyes would follow the boat as it sailed down under the evening breeze. His adventurous mind would sail leagues beyond the boat to the islands and mountains from which the Greeks came, where temples were reflected in the sea. But the boy Saul on the river bank would not imagine that, just because he knew the Greek language, he would some day be able to make wonderful journeys such as no man of his race had ever taken before, and not only to speak so that the people of that day in scores of cities from Jerusalem to Rome might hear him, but to write so that we and millions of others today and in all the days to come can share his wonderful story and listen to his great secret. The lovely Greek thread was woven to and fro in the pattern of Saul's mind. It gleamed like gold as it lay intertwined with the rich thread of the story of his own Jewish people. There was a third thread, not so beautiful as these but very strong, the imperial thread of Rome. 3. The thread of empire. "When I was a boy," one of the oldest sailors on the quay at Tarsus would begin, and we can imagine the boy Saul with others standing round waiting for the yarn. "When I was a boy, and Mark Antony, the Roman ruler, lived up yonder at the palace, the Queen of Egypt came to Tarsus through the harbour here. Never was such a ship in all the world. The barge she sat in seemed to burn on the water. The poop was covered with beaten gold, and the oars were shining silver that flashed as they dipped and rose in the river, keeping time to the playing of flutes. The sails were purple, and on the deck on a couch lay Cleopatra the queen, with boys standing by fanning her, and with maids in attendance. You could not see the harbour here for people. Everyone in Tarsus came out. The housetops, the quays, and the boats all were covered with them." We can imagine that one of the boys fresh from school would ask, "Do the Romans rule in Egypt where Cleopatra came from as they do here?" And many a sailor in Tarsus harbour would be able to say, "Yes, I have sailed for many a year up and down the great sea, and never have I dropped anchor where the Romans do not rule. I have sailed from here down the Syrian coast, to Tyre and Sidon and Caesarea, and across there to Cyprus, right away down to Alexandria in Egypt, where the great corn ships anchor, and across from the Nile to Syracuse in Sicily. I have sailed from Brundisium up the Gulf of Corinth and seen my ship dragged across the rollers to drop again into the gulf that leads to Athens. From Athens I have sailed to Ephesus and round the coast to Rhodes and back to Tarsus, and everywhere, everywhere you see the power of Rome ruling." And then the old sailor would not have told all, for he would not know that, when the great general Julius Caesar sailed for Tarsus nearly half a century before Paul was born, he had already begun the conquest of a savage island called Britain, in the North Sea far beyond the Alps. Saul, as he went back home, would pass the many-pillared porticos of stately Roman temples. As he got into the heart of the city again, he might see the road swiftly cleared at the sound of the wild clatter of horses' hoofs on the paved way. As the panting beasts, flecked with white sweat, swept by on the last mile of their long gallop down from the mountains, he would know that this was the Roman post that had sped, by relay after relay of horses, right across Asia Minor bearing the emperor's commands. 3 words would spring to his lips: "Civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, free born." And with that thought, though he knew how many of his fellow Jews loathed the Roman rule, there would come the broadening feeling of possession in that empire which had made the Great Sea its lake. It was the third thread in Saul's life, the strong, rough thread of the Roman Imperium. So the 3 threads were woven into the pattern of a boy's mind, the boy Saul who could say, speaking in the language of Greece, "I am a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, a native of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. I am a Roman born." He was a citizen of the world. End of chapter 2.